Welcome to the first unit of Ragtime 101, the Ragtime University, something we're trying new this year. Hopefully all of you are ready for a wonderful, vivid learning experience. So let's get started. I worked hard to do that one. All right, so good morning. With me is Dr. William Mcnally. He actually got one of those FUDs, right? PhD, yes. And he wrote quite an extensive treatise focused partially on ragtime. I was mentioned in it, so that was very nice.
Thank you.
Okay, and then our festival historian, but who is also very well musically educated, we have Mr. David Refkin.
Thank you. And just to clarify, my initials are DR, but he's the actual doctor.
Yes. Okay, and I've seen one on TV, so. So good morning. We have a nice format. Yes, I did this too. It's not fast, but okay. Anyhow, here we go. And here is the basis. This is the last time it's going to happen. The basis, where did ragtime music come from? I get asked that every festival. And every festival I change my answer because we learn more and more about it. So this time I'm going to shut up and let these two very educated musical guys talk about ragtime, where it came from in the 19th century. So question one, what would you consider, takes a while to write this, to be, or how would you describe, it was faster when I did this at home, the state or existence of so-called popular music in, are you ready? In the mid-19th century. That'd be both antebellum and postbellum. And for those of you who didn't take lit, that's before and after the Civil War. So.
Well, all right. I'm going to start before the French Revolution of 1848. But actually, I think taking a look at what was going on in Europe across the 19th century makes a little bit of sense to put this all into context. So you have, in the first half of the 19th century in Europe, a growing class of serious virtuosos. You have Chopin and Paganini on violin, and Franz Liszt on piano, and Thalberg was Liszt's great competitor. You have this whole class of virtuosos, and they're now touring all over the continent, and they're giving performances in the very wealthy salons, and this kind of tends to gravitate around Paris. Now, Paris is rich, but Paris also has just overthrown their royalty not that long ago. But by 1848, those revolutionaries have now become kind of aristocratic snobs, and basically, the interest in virtuosity and the culture around that. I mean, Liszt was such a performer that women were actually throwing diamond necklaces at him. But that ultimately has to implode. There are so many virtuosos crawling all over Europe that they're not new anymore. And then you have this new class of musician that comes along, and they start playing music that they didn't write. Mendelssohn kind of kicks this off when he conducts the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and that's in the 1830s. But it becomes routine all of a sudden for people to be playing Beethoven sonatas and for people to be including Bach on their recital programs. And recital programs just began to look more and more and more and more serious. And this ultimately is a process of alienation, and it's the process that separates classical music from popular music. You have kind of an exodus from Paris, and the Germanic lands kind of take over the classical music tradition in Europe. And a small group of these classical enthusiasts are the great promoters of Richard Wagner. Now, however beautiful you think a particular melody of Wagner is, sitting through a 6-hour Wagner opera was never for everybody. and it just became a really kind of gradual process. And I had this line kind of written out. People became perfectly content to be confused, bored, annoyed, in order to just get that tiny little glimmer of enlightenment from all of this new music. Well, so musical composition in the classical world is on a path toward obscurity, which is the same path toward alienating the popular audience. And that's a problem. Now, fortunately, there's a lag period over in the United States. And that lag period wasn't an instrumental lag period. Americans were content to be building their own instruments. Now, the piano's invented in 1700. The colonies weren't much of anything in 1700, but very much against British law, American innovators wanted to build pianos early on. And even by 1800, there was an American that, independent of any Europeans, invented the upright piano. And also, in 1801, invented a cast iron frame for a piano. Now, that way predates the cast iron frames that Chickering was using in their square grand pianos of the 1830s, and ultimately Chickering and Steinway were building those cast iron frames into grand pianos in the 1840s. But, by the way, the piano there on the left is one of those 1801 pianos. It actually had a folding keyboard to make it particularly transportable. So you actually had portable instruments. I mean, American innovation in pianos was a big thing early on. And I want to try to kind of streamline this toward a finish line here, but piano sales were great early on. And a big piano culture existed early on. And by the time you get to, well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself to bring in Gottschalk, but...
You are.
Well, all right, why don't I just leave it at that? We have Germans coming to the United States to teach serious music by the 1830s. And they're starting to teach that kind of music with piety approach, and that classical music should be serious. And the American school of music composition grows out of this German mentality. So I'll stop there.
Do you have anything to add to that?
That is an excellent, really quick analysis of the sort of background from the European to the American, the transition point of view, and about pianos, the importance of pianos, obviously, and the importance of the concept of what music meant, formally presented music to the public. There's a whole other, many other sides to the question about where ragtime came from, and as important as what you've just heard is to the story, another important segment to it is sort of the sociological approach, what was happening in the mid-1800s in America generally with music. And I'm speaking of what music was as a presentation to the general population, not those who went to the big formal concerts. And a lot of these concerts were not in very fancy halls that we have now. They were informal presentations, right down to setting up a tent at the side of the road.
The big halls really weren't even built yet.
Yeah. So music was really in the streets, literally, and on the sidewalks and in the yards and in the front parlors and the back parlors and the houses. People's idea of being entertained mostly was entertaining themselves or someone who happened to be coming through town that they may have heard of and went to go hear them play. Music was a very hands-on sort of operation back then. We think of buying subscription seasons at concert halls to go hear a symphony through the year. If you were living in 1880, you would go, if you wanted some music, you'd pick up a banjo or you'd maybe pick up a fiddle and play tunes by ear. Reading written music at this level really was not the way that most people produced the music. They made it up, improvisation, and not to extend this point too much, but if you're talking about skipping over the ragtime era toward the jazz era, which what ragtime sort of folded into, improvisation and playing little variations on tunes, like we have variations in rags, that goes back at least to the early 1700s in the Baroque era, where ornamentation, you play a melody and then you ornament it to death so it doesn't even remotely look like the printed score. Improvising goes back then. And the very last thing I'll say about this, because it's really, really important, is a lot of what we understand about ragtime is what we understand about almost all popular music, and in fact, almost all music. Most music, if you trace it back, any kind of music, goes back in its origins, probably having something to do with dancing. Dance is a major part of our music history.
I'm going to complicate that very last point a bit. My approach had always been to look at music as falling into one of two camps, dance or song. And I think song is really, the premise is narrative. And it doesn't even require rhythmic structure. So, I mean, you can look all the way back into the 13th century churches, and our Gregorian chant just tells a story on pitches.
Well, let's move to our second question. Can you describe what might be considered American classical music, because it does exist, and did it approach the level of European masters of the second half of the 19th century?
Well, there's some peculiarities about American symphonic music, what we now call classical music. Of course, they didn't call it back then when they were in the middle of it. One of them is, if you take a look at a lot of American symphonies, the structure of the symphony as composed by Americans, it's a little different from the typical European structure of a symphony. Most European symphonies have traditionally 4 movements. Many American symphonies have 3 movements. This is something I did not quite notice until a couple of different people had brought it to my attention. I have played some of these pieces. There's a certain economy in how a symphony was written in the United States, and there's a certain economy in the form and in other aspects of American music, which sort of points very generally and vaguely points to that idea of sort of the efficiency, American efficiency, and the whole idea of production lines and all of that. I don't mean to be making an exact comparison there, but American symphonic music really did not make a name for itself, so to speak. These pieces did not, for some reason, accumulate a reputation as pieces of greatness, with rare exception. But I would recommend for anybody who's going to be doing a little research, gets interested in this topic, to go look up a composer by the name of John Knowles Paine, P-A-I-N-E, a remarkable early American composer who set the stage, so to speak, for symphonic music in this country. A great story. If we had the time, I'd tell you a little bit about John Knowles Paine, but that would be a good focus for you.
Dr. Mcnally.
I'll just add into this. I mean, I do think that most of what we would call American classical music of the 19th century is imitation of European styles, and especially Germanic styles. If I were to compare it to the European masters, it doesn't compare very favorably for the most part, because it was an imitation, and it did not have the academic background kind of necessary to generate first-rate imitation.
All right. That's fair enough. No,
I mean, by 1850, 1860, we're starting to bring in enough serious composers. I'm now talking still kind of in the 1840 to 1860 range. We're just starting to assemble orchestral ensembles large enough to even survive a performance of anything that we would consider symphonic today.
Okay, well, our next question, moving more to American, how did American ethnic music forms play into this in print and in general circulation? And minstrelsy has to be brought up because that was one of the major forms of dissemination of the second half of the 19th century.
Let me take a small part of the front side of this question, which is just to say that sheet music publication existed, and it was pretty healthy, actually, from right at the beginning of the 19th century in America. And I have a little list of song titles here that they were formulaic. And they were formulaic very much in a similar way that ragtime sheet music production became formulaic at the beginning of the 20th century. But, sweet is the summer's fragrant gale, sweet is the balmy breath of spring, sweet lilies of the valley, sweet echo, sweet babes in the wood, sweet girl by the light of the moon, sweet Myra the whale, sweet Nan of Hampton Green, sweet Paul of Plymouth. And other words, poor was a really popular word. So you had poor black boy, poor blind girl, poor little child of a tar, poor little gypsy, poor village boy, poor Emma. And you had people that would sort of stack these together. The sweet little cottage, that was a real winner. So, I mean, you had tons and tons and tons of sheet music available. Certainly not all of it was high quality stuff, but there was a lot of it.
Yeah, and another one of the major forms of music that was very popular, becoming really quite popular, as we talk especially about the 1870s and 80s, headed toward 1900, was the march. The march was a reflection of a very basic biological mechanism, walking, or marching. And so everything is in 2 beats, and for the most part, and the ragtime form itself actually evolved pretty directly out of the march. In other words, the structures of the themes and so forth. But if you go a little deeper than that into the subject of marches, now we're looking at the marches that were brought over. The immigrants to America bringing their marches from Italy and France and Scandinavia, German marches. Those were the basis, just as he was saying about the European forms of classical music and orchestra music and so forth. The European marches set the stage for American marches. American marches, combined with some of these other points about dance and so forth, all are part of what eventually evolved into a ragtime form. And some other aspects of the music I guess we'll talk about, but form is really the key here. How these little gems of music that we finally know as rags evolved. The step before that is what ragtime is itself, and that's another separate rhythmic question, not having to do with form, but just the basic unit of rhythm.
But there were other dance forms, right? Gavottes and schottisches,
Yes.
and what are some of the faster types of polkas?
Polka, sure, Wandler. As a matter of fact, in today's concert, I'll put in the tiniest little plug. I'm going to be playing a schottisch on today's program. So you get firsthand idea what a schottisch is by the end of the day today.
So what influence do you think these existing forms mixed with cultural trends, and cultural trends by that time were a bit separate from Europe in this country? What do they have on early ragtime forms like the Cakewalk, which is late 1880s, early 1890s, and mildly syncopated songs?
Well, again, the Cakewalk obviously is the dance element, and I have to say that there's a large question among those of us who study, where did ragtime come from, meaning the ragtime rhythms. They were in existence long before any of the musics we've so far been talking about, syncopated rhythms. But it was the idea of putting them together and creating a complete melody, completing a phrase, an entire piece made out of these syncopated rhythms. So the dances that were being performed to these European forms, the schottisch and the polka and all of that, around 1900, things started speeding up. The dances were following the music. The musicians set the stage for the dancing. The tempo started to increase, and the changes, the little turns that the dancers have to make becomes a lot more sophisticated, and at the same time, some simpler dances are created, the one-step, the two-step. All of this had evolved from the history of people enjoying the music, not by sitting there and listening to it, but by moving. And so a big part of ragtime, the image we have of ragtime music, is about this action. It's a very active music. It's a music that gets you, lively is the word that comes to the mind most. This is part of the ragtime culture, and this is what evolved from these many different steps and these many different conditions before what we call the ragtime era came around.
So it didn't just get invented in 1895?
Nope.
Okay.
Not by a long shot, but there is a pretty important point of clarity here, because there's of course, always a lot of talk about where the black musicians had their rhythmic sensibility. And there is absolutely nothing that I have ever found that suggests that the ragtime rhythms or those kinds of syncopations had anything to do with African continental music. That's really, it just wasn't. The closest thing you have is something called patting juba, and that's a far cry. I mean, it's really just kind of patting on your knees. The structure of syncopation in ragtime was based on European foundations.
Yeah, and we've spent a lot of time analyzing rags to death to find out where this particular melodic pattern came from. Oh yeah, I found this 2 years earlier on another piece. All this stuff goes all the way back. Any subject, whatever happened to be interested in music or non-music, you study the history, you find out, well, there was a little precedent for that before this. In ragtime, you have to be very, very careful. If you're in a discussion with somebody and you're talking about where ragtime came from, and it even took, in the early years of this festival, when we had seminars, among the first questions was, what is ragtime? How do you know it when you hear it? Some very basic seminar questions in those days. You have to be very careful whether you are speaking of the ragtime rhythm, a very specific syncopated rhythm, ragtime song, ragtime instrumental pieces, 3-minute pieces we call rags, or ragtime culture, what was going on in the city where this music was played, what was the ragtime life kind of like. And in a very larger sense, ragtime, that 15 or so year period at the turn of the century, that where a lot of things like what we've been talking about quickly evolved and started moving simultaneously because of a lot of technological innovation at the time, which propelled it forward, and we will get to that also. But if you ask the question about, well, what's ragtime or where did it came from, you got to be kind of specific. Are you talking about something mechanical in the music, or something about the music itself overall, or generally the ragtime culture or the ragtime era?
I want to take, before we head on to our next question, this will just be a quick couple of definitions that if not everybody in the room knows what a cakewalk rhythm is, this is going to be kind of a helpful little thing. The cakewalk rhythm, it's always inside of a measure. And if this is our measure beat, 1, 2, 1, 2. The thing is, the syncopation never got more complex than that. It never got any different than that in a cakewalk. But maybe only a quarter to a third of the measures in any given piece were syncopated at all. So ragtime ends up being not a whole lot different, except there was syncopation that then happened on the second half of the measure, and that allowed for a bunch more permutations inside a measure.
And even across the bar.
Well, that's later.
Yeah, later. But
I mean, that isn't until 1911, 1912.
no, the entertainer.
Well, there are individual measure exceptions, but where those became regularly used techniques.
It's the entertainer. Da 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 da. That goes over the bar.
Not tied.
Yep.
Uh-oh.
This is fun.
These two guys are staring out. I'll tell you this joke about these two.
Okay. Moving on, we have to tackle this issue. No tweeting on it. We know that's a no-no nowadays. Can you describe the contributions development in terms of race and culture regarding that race and racial perceptions are an unavoidable aspect of this period? And it doesn't just have to be black. I mean, there were Irish in this country, there were Asians in this country, and all of them had some contributions.
I would just like to point out a couple of small things. One is, black entertainers associated with minstrelsy and associated with the tent shows, the traveling shows, the mid-1800s, toward the late 1800s. The blacks were discovered that their talents had value, entertaining each other. And they discovered their talents had value because the whites, in essence, were bringing them in. They had the blacks entertain the whites. They hired them, in a sense. And this was an opportunity in show business And in the attention-getting world of being an entertainer, that was refreshing and welcomed by the blacks. We have a long history in this country of whites hiring the blacks for their entertainers, much like you would hire a waiter to serve the food or whatever. And we're talking now some time ago. And we're talking about this period. But that's sort of the cartoon image people have of the relationship of blacks to whites in entertainment. But actually, the blacks looked at this as a great, great opportunity to suddenly become part of an upper society by being members of the entertainment and part of the scene. They were worth something, and for their specific talents.
And entertainment was becoming big. By 1850, P.T. Barnum manages to bring Jenny Lind to the United States. And people understood by 1850 who Jenny Lind was. This was not happening in a vacuum. I mean, I think it's really important to just kind of keep reiterating how big and how complex and how vibrant America already was by 1850. Because, as we look at history today, we really think a lot about what took place across the 20th century. But great spectacles were already very much in force of any kind. And that leads to building concert halls.
I'd like to
We'll get there, but
add one more thing to this.
yes, please.
That this is where the term, America's a melting pot really becomes an active term when we're speaking now of immigrants from any country coming to this country to get their opportunities. They didn't just bring their own music and their own culture, and to some extent they had, their own communities, a sort of private activity, but most of it was pretty quickly, over a short period of time, merged with American music. Just look at New York, later on with on Broadway and off Broadway, and the types of music, especially dance music, again, I point out, and the vocals. These are merged forms. You really can't listen to music in that era and really hear specific countries identified. Sometimes you can hear the influence of 2 or 3 countries merged together. This is a part of the wonderful part of what America evolved to as far as the music. But this was already happening before 1900. It wasn't as quick, it wasn't as well defined, but you just can't avoid it. People arriving in one country from another, their cultures merge. It just happens to be pretty clearly seen in the music that we just happen to be talking about here.
So you want to tell me about what we're seeing here, Chickering Hall?
Okay, so this is built in 1875. Now, Chickering is already winning awards in Europe for the manufacture of their pianos, but now the business of serious music making and serious performer level musicians has really taken off in America. So now we have national tours, and we're bringing in Europeans to give American tours, and we now need places to put them. So to say that we now have concert halls dedicated to classical events, that's already vibrant by the 1870s. There are a bunch of them. Steinway Hall ends up being built not far away, not much later. Rather interestingly, this Chickering Hall in 1875, and I think it was raised in 1905, but Scott Joplin, when he first moved to New York, had to have been living in this building's shadow. This was on 18th Street, and that was.
And actually, some of the earlier publishers, and it has something to do with this, in New York, before Tin Pan Alley got established, 28th Street, they started between 17th and 18th Street. So that's part of it. I wanted to add one of the microcultures which contributed to ragtime, but was almost exclusively the domain of the African Americans, was church and the music done there, and the spirituals that grew up there.
Yeah, if you're going to study ragtime to some depth, you have to include the blues, and to some extent spirituals and gospel. I mean, these are really hard to separate out within a melody. to say, oh, did this come from a church or did this come up from a back alley somewhere, this particular melody? It's not like that. It's just the feeling of what a rag is and the feeling of what a blues is were really actually more similar than different at the beginnings of those histories. And blues, you cannot separate out blues from ragtime when you're studying ragtime. They're really related.
So I want to get to, go ahead.
Just a small thing that even if you look at some of the American early patriotic, well, I say early, but the patriotic songs of the Civil War era and the Stephen Foster songs. I mean, these are songs that are really barely removed from just a hymn book. They really track right alongside spiritual melodies.
Yeah, and this was sort of in vogue, and those entertainers who were prone to including comedy in their act was to start with what sounded like a standard hymn tune and then, as we would say, rag it. It probably didn't call it back in the earliest days of doing it, that they were just sort of having fun with a tune, but there was a lot of that.
Let's get to the core of what many thought ragtime was all about. Obviously it's not, but can you briefly demonstrate the concept of syncopation, or as they called it then, syncopation, and then give us a potential reason why it became such an emotional and divisive element of music in the 1890s. And it was divisive, and there were a lot of newspaper articles on this. So.
All right, well, I'll start with this. In music, there's enormous value in repetition, and that means formal repetition, and it means repetition kind of at the micro level. Now, what I mean by this, and I might just wander over to the piano and kind of demonstrate a little bit of this. Beethoven really understood repetition. Yeah, I'm just going to wander on over.
Talk loud.
That was repetition.
We can take a beautiful line that starts something like this. Now it sounds nice, but it's not really going anywhere, right? Just by repeating those notes, like really needling you listeners, it's become kind of an electrifying experience. Similarly, if it was just, I just didn't do it. And if Beethoven really was the first classical composer to really recognize the potential in repetition to its fullest, all of these other layers of musicians understood in some way or another that repetition was a key to their musical success. And I mean, you actually had machines being invented to write songs because they could be so formulaic, like actual mechanical machines. But in ragtime, I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit to talk about ragtime syncopation, but the syncopation was extremely regulated in ragtime. If you have whole notes and half notes and quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes and 32nd notes, the only syncopation in ragtime is between adjacent note values, quarter and eighth, or eighth and 16th. This is where all syncopation takes place. And it's regulated to that. We're dependent on that as a repetitive component of the ragtime style.
Yeah, for those of you who want to look up some ancient music, as I've done over the years for a radio show, trying to find every example of early examples of syncopation in so-called classical music, there's a Beethoven bagatelle, I forget the numbers, but it has 9 measures of unrelenting whipping syncopation. It's just 9 measures in the entire piece, but it's worth listening to. And I found the earliest example I found of intact, complete syncopation in a row being used as an obvious tool in the toolbox goes back to Scarlatti. piano composer. So there are these fragments that sort of dropped in, I wouldn't say by accident, but it was an idea that if somebody else had done it, or if a couple of people had heard it and said, that's pretty good, we could have had the ragtime era, 100 years earlier. I'm kind of joking. But it's just this idea of syncopation did not take off until it became part of this other cluster of things.
Well, it's not only that it didn't take off, it was repressed. When Beethoven wrote that syncopation, I think you're thinking of the last movement of Opus 111. It's one of the last sonatas Beethoven wrote.
No, it's another
Bagatelle
one.
as well. Okay, I mean, he did it a few times across more than just a couple of measures. And people found it to be crass. People found it to be impolite. It was sort of jarring and jangling, and they didn't like that they were being kind of rhythmically jostled because they were busy listening to harmonic progressions and they were busy listening to a melodic line, and this interrupted that.
I think the connecting point between this discussion of these formal piano pieces and the popularity of ragtime and how it all came about, just what it seems like now, rather suddenly, the ragtime explosion, was due to this. If you were writing a piece of music, you no longer had to call it Sonata Opus 50 number 2 in E flat minor. You could call it Frog Legs Rag. There was a sort of freedom given to composers suddenly to be humorous and a certain musical freedom that goes along with that.
Well, I want to ask you, Dr. Mcnally, about this guy, Louis Moreau Gottschalk.
Well, okay, he's born in 1829. He dies in 1869. In 1865, at the height of his popularity, he gets in trouble with a girl at a boarding school in San Francisco. He's chased out of the country at night, as a stowaway on a boat, lands in Brazil, and dies in Brazil. He never returns to the United States. But he is a pianist truly in the model of Liszt. He, first of all, really refines his virtuosic technique. He's a New Orleans pianist, by the way. Really, really refines his virtuosic technique. And then he starts composing in the style of Liszt, sort of, as well. And kind of a key element of this, he's writing this really, really, really virtuosic texture only to make a very, very clear melodic line stand out on top. And I'll play two little fragments from a piece called The Union, which, it's some 18 pages long, and the first 6 pages are the introduction. So,
Actually, Gottschalk sort of lived like Liszt, too, a bit of a scoundrel.
I never thought of Liszt as a scoundrel.
Well, he had the women for him, so.
Yes, but they came from him.
Yeah.
One at a time.
We almost had a melody there, but it still doesn't go anywhere, and it still doesn't go anywhere. And okay, here I am several pages later. just play that. And then it goes back to another long virtuosic passage. And then another patriotic hymn just appears. Now he starts using the piano for special effects. This is just, sorry, one last little snippet here.
Are you getting paid mileage for this?
So, okay, we have a melody that starts. But he then brings in military drums.
We have to stop before this gets Wagnerian.
Let me add just one more comment.
Yes.
But it's also
Yeah.
it's one of the early examples of special effects in piano play.
And if you're interested in making a little bit of a musical tie between Gottschalk and the very beginnings of the Cakewalk ragtime part of the century, check out a piece of Gottschalk's called Ojos Criollos, Creole Eyes. And it is basically an extended Cakewalk piece in a wonderful form and a really delightful set of melodies. Ojos Criollos, I recommend it. It's sort of a musical tie there, bridging the Gottschalk to later times that he seemed to forecast somehow.
So he's some of the early fusion of
Absolutely.
European classical forms and American melodies. Okay. Well, can you point to any cultural changes in the American landscape, urbanization, early media, that might have led to a veritable explosion of, early ragtime forms, of course, from the mid-1890s into the new century? I'm going to address a couple of those. One of the basic ones you don't even think about, how does this have anything to do with ragtime? It has to do with getting to it. Urban transportation, it's streetcars and even the early automobiles and ways for people to get around. Cable cars, these are 1880s, 1890s when they come into existence, but it's a new way to get to town. Los Angeles had a great interurban system that went way out into the boondocks, but farmers were using them. Phonographs, of course, came out in the 1890s. The early vestiges of what will become player pianos. And can you name other examples?
Yeah, well, basically creative uses of electricity that allowed people to be able to hear and see and, record, particularly. Recording was must have been, we can't even imagine this, what sort of cultural shift it meant that people could record their own music or somebody else's music. I want to mention that, we do concentrate on the piano, rightfully so, as being largely in the center of our ragtime music, but it didn't start off that way. These ragged rhythms, these ragged melodies, this idea of syncopating tunes for fun, these were all, as I said earlier on, products of music on the street, people's music, people making music for themselves. Not every house had a piano at that time, but a lot of them had guitars and fiddles and banjos, and most of these early pieces, not the rags themselves, but these early fragments of rags of rags, if you will, were played on instruments. A lot of people could play, if not very sophisticatedly. They could play a little bit of fiddle, a little bit of banjo, and so forth. And then they would form their little groups, and the little groups would become locally famous for a while. All that was in place before Scott Joplin started writing rags for piano, and before anyone's, and so the idea of being able to play what became a popular music yourself, I think, really contributed to the fast ramp up of ragtime, because popular music was coming along, these ragtime songs, and rags is heard on the piano rolls, and already people were used to playing music themselves, so it was not a stretch for them to imitate what they heard. And so this ragtime was suddenly everywhere because the mechanism had already been set up to do that. And then the fast publication of piano sheet music and a lot of and broadcasting later on. I mean, a lot of things just technologically came together in 20 years.
Did you have anything to add? Okay, well, now I have the big final question here. Do you regard ragtime as America's original indigenous form of popular composition, or is it maybe a bit more complicated than that?
It's always more complicated.
Absolutely.
But the short answer is yes. I absolutely think ragtime is the first nameable musical genre that really had no precedent anywhere on the European continent.
Yeah, I think the line has to be drawn somewhere, and that's where it probably should be drawn. But I would really also highlight the words composition and innovation. I mean, you're really talking about something that did not happen on a Tuesday in 1896. Everything about ragtime is like everything about everything else, pretty much. It was slow, it was insidious. People didn't realize it was happening to them until it happened, and didn't give it a name until it sort of collectively happened after a long while. And even the name is kind of a long question. We could do a whole seminar on the word rag itself. Where did that come from? But if the line has to be drawn somewhere, it undoubtedly would be that rags, published rags as unified pieces of music with titles, complete sense of form, a composer, maybe an arranger, and a person who was identified as it being one of their hit tunes to put on their program. All of that is really the beginnings of identifiable American music.
Go ahead.
I'm going to play actually one more small fragment, and I promise I'll keep this one short. But it's to display what people were trying to call American-sounding music. This happened to be a composer named George Chadwick, who was one of the Boston Six, along with the much more famous Edward McDowell. Now, these are really, they're good composers. McDowell may even be an almost great composer. But their sense of what American music was still based on European ideals entirely. So the classical community is trying to come up with an American voice, and they are failing. So what I'm going to play is a small snippet of what was considered to have a particularly American sound by his contemporaries. It's lovely music, but it sounds like a hybrid of Edvard Grieg and Robert Schumann. There is nothing that I have been able to identify in any of the music of the Boston Six. These are composers at the end of the 19th century operating in America. There's nothing I've been able to find in a single piece of theirs that I would describe as patently and uniquely American.
Okay, you had a story.
Just a tiny little anecdote here to kind of not summarize everything, but maybe help bridge to your next class coming up here in terms of the popularity of ragtime and why is it so immediately attractive. I had a job playing for years at a hotel in San Francisco with my trio. It was not ragtime job. It was salon music, more of the sort of sedate stuff from that era, the old, what they call palm court music. And it was a wonderful job for that reason to be able to play all that stuff. But one day we were playing this Thomas Allen piece, and Thomas Allen's actually known for some rags, but we were playing one of his intermezzos, just a very nice, sedate, little, quiet piece. In the last 8 measures, somewhere in the middle of the last 8 measures, it just out of pure inspiration, I decided to syncopate 2 measures. Keep this in mind, this is like a 3.5-minute piece, There was the only syncopation, and it was a little bit improvised for 2 measures. We finished playing, and the person sitting, the customer to my left, leaned over and said, "What Joplin rag was that?" It doesn't take much.
So I would like to thank Dr. Mcnally and Dr. Refkin for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Okay.